Hi there, I'm Stephanie Ruhle. It's Thursday, April 22nd, and this morning the nation begins to move on from the George Floyd verdict and focusing on how to change the culture and the circumstances that led to his death. In the city of Minneapolis, that means a new investigation by the Justice Department into how the city's police department operates. And in Washington, D.C., it means a new push to get police reform done in George Floyd's name, finally on a federal level. To this point, those efforts have hit a wall, but new discussions are underway, leading to hope that new federal reforms could finally get passed. But all of that is for the future. I want to talk about what is happening today. In the city of Minneapolis, just a few hours from now, a funeral is being held for Daunte Wright, the 20-year-old black man who was shot during a traffic stop and an attempted arrest just 11 days ago. At the same time, new police shootings in other states are sparking protests as well as demands for answers and accountability. In Ohio, a criminal investigation is underway after a police officer shot and killed a 16-year-old black girl, Ma'Khia Bryant. She is a young woman who had a knife. And in the state of North Carolina, demands for transparency after a black man, Andrew Brown, was shot and killed by deputies there who were trying to serve a search warrant. We've got a ton to cover this morning with reporters all over the country to help us do it on the ground. Shaquille Brewster in Minneapolis, Maura Barrett in Columbus, Ohio, and Katie Beck in Elizabeth City, North Carolina. Shaq, you know I am starting with you. In the last 3 days, we have gotten Derek Chauvin's verdict. We have seen now this review taking place into the Minneapolis Police Department, and now Daunte Miller is being laid to rest later today. This city has been through the ringer. Excuse me, Daunte Wright.
No, that's exactly right, Stephanie. I mean, there have been some big headlines here bringing a range of emotions. Of course, today we'll be laying to rest Daunte Wright, 20 years old, who was shot 11 days ago, shot and killed by a Brooklyn Center police officer who yelled taser, 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 and then fired that single shot into Daunte Wright. We'll expect to hear from his family, from his friends, his family, parents, mother and father, and then we'll hear from his 6 siblings. We'll also hear from some political leaders. We'll hear from the Reverend Al Sharpton, who will deliver the eulogy. We'll hear from Ben Crump, the family attorney, who will deliver what the family is calling a plea for justice. We also know Senator Amy Klobuchar will be in attendance for this memorial service that is set to begin at noon local time. Now, as that is happening, you mentioned the other headlines around the city of Minneapolis. Yesterday, the Department of Justice launching that federal pattern and practice investigation into the Minneapolis Police Department, looking to see if there was pattern and practice of excessive force being used, of discriminatory policies. That was a move that was welcomed by many people here on the ground in Minneapolis, including members of the city council who, in the weeks after George Floyd's death, called for that police department to be defunded and disbanded. You even heard the police chief, Madera Arredondo, say that he welcomed the probe, and he said he would fully comply with it. And then, of course, we know earlier this week we heard the verdict, the conviction of Derek Chauvin. We know Derek Chauvin is in the most secure prison in this state, being held in the most secure unit of that prison. So a lot going on here in Minneapolis, and the focus today is on Daunte Wright.
Mara, take us to Columbus. What is the latest on the shooting? I know they have been moving fast to get information out.
Extremely fast, Stephanie. We got one bit of body cam video the same evening that Ma'Khia Bryant was shot on Tuesday afternoon, and then got more body cam video and 911 calls, the audio of those calls just yesterday. I want to show you a bit of the perspective that we got from those body cam videos, but I want to warn our viewers that the images may be disturbing. So you might be able to see there that Ma'Khia Bryant had a knife in her hand when she was shot. We hear the officer shoot 4 times total, but we don't know what led up to the incident. All we know is that a 911 call was called for police to come to the site, where we then saw what happened there. The investigation has now been turned over to the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigations. Ma'Khia Bryant's family expressing heartbreak, saying that she was defending herself in this situation. There's been some speculation speculation from people in the community about why a taser wasn't used or why the officer didn't shoot at her leg to disarm her. The police chief here in Columbus defending that use of force based on the training the officer received, and that shooting for the leg would have been a small target. I want you to hear a bit from the mayor of Columbus, who acknowledges the fact that there's a tough relationship between the city of Columbus and the police department here, and how he thinks that they should work forward.
There's no doubt about it that the communities of color in this city and cities across this country are demanding change and reform and a different type of relationship with the police moving forward, going from a law enforcement organization to a community policing organization. And that is the journey that we're on here in Columbus, and it can't happen soon enough.
We saw peaceful demonstrations across the city last night, as well as a vigil for Ma'Khia Bryant, in which community members were expressing the need for police reform. Here in Ohio, actually, Republican lawmakers have introduced a bill that would call for an oversight board as well as a database to track police use of force incidents. Stephanie?
Republicans and Democrats calling for more oversight at the very least. Bipartisanship is without a doubt what we need. Katie, take us to North Carolina, because information where you are has been a lot harder to come by regarding the shooting of Andrew Brown. What do you know?
That's right, Steph. This investigation is really still in the nascent stages. It's now in the hands of the State Bureau of Investigations. Yesterday, authorities had a press conference, but really didn't give many specifics as to exactly what happened in this confrontation. What we do know is that about 8:30 yesterday morning, authorities were serving a search warrant on Andrew Brown, and that is when a deadly confrontation occurred and he was killed. Beyond that, we don't have much information. We do have yet another community demanding answers, demanding accountability and transparency. That includes from the city council here in Elizabeth City. They had an emergency session last night, and they are demanding to know exactly what happened, piece by piece, a timeline of how this confrontation occurred. And police say there is body cam video that they will be reviewing in coming days to sort of put those pieces together. As of right now, they are not saying anything about what happened in that interaction and what caused the death of Andrew Brown. His family here in Elizabeth City, obviously in the same position as so many others you've been mentioning, very distraught, demanding transparency and answers to understand exactly what happened in this confrontation that led to his death. Steph?
Took place 24 hours ago, and we are waiting to see that body cam footage. Katie, Mara, Shaq, thank you all so much. I want to bring in Reverend Al Sharpton, the host here of Politics Nation on MSNBC and the president of the National Action Network. He will be delivering the eulogy at Daunte Wright's funeral later today. Reverend, what a week. The Chauvin verdict, now the Wright funeral. What is your sense of this moment and where we're headed as a country? In theory, we're headed in the right direction, but you have stood up at that podium for decades.
I think that we are in a very serious moment of real opportunity to deal with the issue of police reform that many of us have tried to get this nation to deal with legislatively for decades. Just as those that I was mentored by dealt with decades of fighting segregation, finally in the early 60s, they were able to get the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. But that came after decades of work. I think that we're at that moment now where we see the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act now before the Senate, already passed the Congress. Because to go in a matter of days, 3 days after a verdict, where for the first time in the history of this state where I'm in, Minnesota, a white police officer was convicted on 2 counts of murder and 1 count of manslaughter. It's time for us to say the time has come to really deal with how we deal with policing in this country. It is good for the public, it is good for the victims in the black community, and it's good for police. And that's going to be part of my message at the eulogy today. When you have a young man like...
Well, Reverend Al, in the last 10 minutes alone, we have talked about 3 different police shootings, and it's easy to lump them together, but they're very different circumstances. If you think about Ma'Khia Bryant in Ohio, she was armed with a knife. We know that Daunte Wright was not armed, and in North Carolina, we basically know nothing. How important is it to deal with each of these cases individually and in context rather than lump them together?
Well, the thing we don't know is the circumstances in North Carolina. We don't know everything about Ohio, whether there was another way he could have dealt with it. The families reached out to us. We don't know everything. We do know a knife was there. We know Dante, there was no knife. But the one thread between all of them and many other cases is the lack of trust in the criminal justice system and law enforcement. That's why you need the legislation. Every case, the police may not be wrong, but every case, they're not right. And that is why there's such distrust, because they've unilaterally always gone with the police. The police is right. Don't question the police. When I stood with the Floyd family the other night and heard the verdict, and all of us broke out in tears, I thought about how I stood in courtrooms with the mother of Amadou Diallo and the mother of Sean Bell and Eric Garner and others that never even got a guilty verdict. Some in Eric Garner's case never even got to court. Michael Brown's case, Tamir Rice's case, they never even got to court. So in many ways, people are saying, well, let's judge things one by one, which may be right, but then judge them one by one. Then when the police kills a 12-year-old boy in Ohio, then judge that one by one. The police have almost had immunity in terms of some areas of law enforcement, and that needs to stop by federal law.
All right, then, Reverend Al, thank you so much. I appreciate you joining me this morning. I know you have a pretty heavy day ahead. Now let's turn to Washington to talk about this very thing, the push for police reform on the federal level. NBC's Garrett Haake, of course, where else is on the Hill. Garrett, you say there's actual optimism around this effort. Does that mean there's a chance something's actually going to get done? I love optimism, but listen, we've all become jaded at this point.
Yeah, let's be skeptical but not cynical about the possibility of something happening here. That's the way I'm approaching this. And look, a police reform bill is the kind of thing that can't be done through reconciliation, can't be done with just Democratic votes. You're going to have to get to 60 in the Senate. And that makes Tim Scott, the Republican senator from South Carolina, a pivotal figure here. He's been given wide latitude to negotiate on behalf of Republicans for the kind of police reform that they might see as acceptable. And he told reporters yesterday he's narrowed this down to 4 or 5 issues that he's negotiating with Karen Bass and Cory Booker on finalizing something that might be able to pass both chambers. Now, remember, the George Floyd Justice and Policing bill includes things like an outright ban on chokeholds, a ban on no-knock, potentially, but not individual officers. Will that be acceptable to Democrats? That remains to be seen. There have been some outside activist groups who say that does not go far enough. But there is a goal now in mind to try to get something to and perhaps through the Senate by May 25th. That would be the anniversary of George Floyd's death. And at least as long as this debate has been going on, yesterday was probably the most optimistic I have seen the involved lawmakers be about the prospect of getting something through to President Biden.
The most optimistic, I will take it. Thank you, Garrett Haake. Let's get smarter on policing and bring in a man who knows a ton about it in this country, Chief Cedric Alexander. He served as police chief for DeKalb County, Georgia. He was president of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives and a member of President Obama's task force on 21st century policing. Chief, I'm so glad you're here. You are the person we want to help us on this. What should the federal government be doing in terms of setting standards for training, hiring, and basically how police do their jobs on a day-to-day basis?
Well, certainly what needs to happen here, Stephanie, is that both sides of the aisle, both Democrats and Republicans, need to role model and demonstrate to the rest of this country a willingness to attempt to do something in this very difficult time that we're in. The separation between philosophies of how they feel about this bill, that needs to be put aside for a moment and look at this for the best interests of the community that's involved. Essentially, that's what it really comes down to. So you have a bill here that's to come together, role model to this country, enact some real federal legislation that's going to help move policing forward in this country, because policing at this very point, at this moment that we're in, at right now, people don't feel that they can trust police in many communities across this country. There are communities that do feel that way, but when you have any part of your larger community do not feel that they can trust their policing, they cannot trust public safety, then we have a problem in this country. And even if we look at these 3 incidents that have occurred here most recently, and even though they may be different in terms of their circumstances, there is a similarity in all of them. And that is that communities right at this very moment don't believe anything that police say. So that is problematic in and of itself. Even when video footage is put in front of you, even when people can see for themselves what the truth is, such as in the George Floyd case and the recent conviction of Derek Chauvin, people want cooperation. People want answers. People want to be able to call the police in the most desperate moments of their life. But they don't want to feel that when they call police, that the chances of their survival lessens really because they call police to the scene. That is not how it's supposed to be. I've been in this job for 40 years. I'm retired now. And I tell you, I am tired of seeing what we're seeing every day. I struggle with it, but we all got to do something much different than what we've been doing in the past. And we need our federal legislators to lead the way and role model for the rest of this country what needs to happen.
Then I want to ask you what this means for the men and women who serve in our police department, or good men and women that might not want to going forward because we don't trust policing in this country. And I want to share a bit of what the president of the Fraternal Order of Police said yesterday. Quote, "It is very obvious that all the rhetoric is having an impact on our ability to recruit the best and brightest. Recruitment is down. Lots of officers are choosing to take their retirement. So what we're seeing is the experience levels of departments going down. You add to that cities downsizing their agencies, putting all these factors together, it is a perfect storm for unsafe communities." What do you say to that?
Well, here's what I will say to that is this. I appreciate his observation and his anecdotal thoughts about it. But let me add another anecdotal thought. As a recently retired chief of police, let me say this. We have been losing police officers for a number of years for a variety of reasons, not just because we're in the moment that we're in. We have young people, particularly millennials, who themselves have other opportunities that they're taking, not just in policing. They're not coming to policing merely because of the criticism policing is under. They're also not coming into policing because of the negative things that they see police doing. So it works both ways, and they have many other opportunities. So what we have to do if we want to recruit the best and the brightest and to retain them is that we have to make sure that you pay them well, you give them good benefits, you give them a good retirement. You have to be really competitive because there's a lot of competition out there for the best and the brightest, and it's no different in policing. And yes, you do have senior officers that are leaving for a variety of reasons. But here's what we do know is that in this environment we're in, and the literature points this out, Stephanie, young people that go into any jobs today only stay 4, 5, 6 years. So we have to have a constant rebuilding and a pipeline of men and women who are coming into the profession. But once we recruit the best and the brightest, we also have to train them adequately to prepare them from this very complex, diverse world that we live in. So we got to look deeper at who we're recruiting. We got to look at our training modalities and how we're training and what we're training, what we need to train more of less of. And then we got to supervise them appropriately. And then we got to bring them into a police culture that is healthy, because many of our cultures across the country can use some help right now and some change. But that change here again is going to start with some federal oversight. And I wouldn't have said this 4, 5, 6 years ago, but today, we need federal support with this problem.
All right, Chief, thank you so much for joining us this morning. We've got to leave it there because we've got breaking news in Washington. President Biden hosting dozens of world leaders virtually to talk climate, and he just made a major announcement on this, of course, Earth Day. I want to go live to Jeff Bennett at the White House. Jeff, what do you say?
Hey, Steph. Well, President Biden is pledging to cut U.S. greenhouse gas emissions in half by the end of the decade, by the year 2030. 2030. So this is part of the U.S. commitment to the Paris Climate Agreement, which the U.S. re-entered under President Biden, reversing that exit under President Trump. And this announcement is coming, yes, on Earth Day, but on the first day of this two-day virtual climate summit here at the White House. The president has convened 40 world leaders, including Russia's Putin and China's Xi Jinping among them. And the president, in his remarks today, said no nation can solve this crisis on our own. All of us, and particularly those of us who represent the world's largest economies, we have to step up. Now, the U.S. faces some skepticism overseas since world leaders have seen U.S. climate policy shift dramatically depending on who occupies the Oval Office. But both the president and vice president certainly want to put the U.S. back at the center of this global effort to combat climate change, Steph.
Jeff Bennett, thank you. Keep us up as any other big announcements come. Coming up next right here, the big question again this morning. Do we need to wear masks outside as the U.S. marks a major vaccine milestone? But we're going to explain why the most important and possibly frightening number today is 11%. Stay with me, 11%. I'm going to tell you what that means. Coronavirus pandemic. The U.S. reaching a grim new milestone this morning, surpassing 32 million total COVID cases since the pandemic began. Overseas, India has now set the record for the most new COVID infections in a 24-hour period, more than 312,000 reported. President Biden outlining plans to reimburse small businesses for giving their employees time off to get vaccinated, while announcing his administration has officially met their goal of 200 million vaccine shots in his first 100 days in office. But that big announcement coming with some, I would say, very worrying news. Over the last few days, daily COVID vaccinations have dropped by 11%. For the first time since February, and we have got to find out why. Joining us now, former CDC Director, Dr. Tom Frieden. Tom, how do you explain this? A drop in vaccinations doesn't ever, why?
Well, I think a few things are going on. First, there was concern with the pause of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, and also there's a lack of supply of that vaccine. So that's one challenge. Second, we have reached the people who are most eager to get vaccinated in many cases. And now the challenge is to reach the unreached. And that is really the theme of what we need to do going forward, reach the unreached. And that's quite diverse. That includes Black and Latinx people in the U.S. That includes Trump voters in rural areas. That includes people around the world who are potentially years away from having access to vaccine unless we do much better.
Well, then let's talk about them, because you participated in another focus group of vaccine-hesitant Trump supporters, and I want to share a bit of what they said. Watch this.
We don't know the side effects, long-term results.
It's being pumped into our thought process too much.
I've been out and about every day since this started, never been sick. I just don't see the rush.
I just see so many different opinions, conclusions, contradictions that just leave me very uncomfortable.
All right, this group had 3 key points. Stop talking about booster shots, don't bully them, and they're sick of Dr. Fauci. How do you win these people over?
Well, first off, I think one theme that really came through in this group is that they feel disrespected. They feel like anyone who asks a question about vaccine is seen as a bad person. And that's a problem, because people have valid concerns, and we need to do more to listen to those concerns and answer them and give people just the facts about vax. There are lots of questions people have, people not yet vaccinated. The good news, Stephanie, is that we're getting essentially a social norm here. Most adults have been vaccinated. A decreasing proportion of people say they're not going to get vaccinated. So we need to reach the unreached, and that means getting vaccine to communities that don't have good access, and that includes some central city areas, some rural elderly. That includes a lot of groups that don't have access yet, and for that, it's crucial that we work with community entities and doctors' offices. We need to get vaccine into more doctors' offices. The doctor is going to be the single most effective person to convince someone to get a vaccination. We need to ramp that up. We need to aim and be more strategic with how we're getting vaccine to people, because that's going to do much more good. If we get vaccine to the highest risk communities, the highest risk people, we'll be able to crush the curve faster.
Get them more facts about vax. I do have to ask you before you go, and I'm almost out of time. Take me out of the ideal situation and get me to the realistic one. This growing debate over whether people should wear masks outside. If we don't have to wear them inside restaurants when we're in an enclosed space sitting across from people, why do we have to wear them outdoors?
Well, it really depends on the level of spread in a community. If you're in Michigan right now, you shouldn't be in a restaurant. Really, frankly. Also, for some outside environments...
Well, then go outside. Do we need them outside?
I would say they're not essential unless there's a very high rate of spread or you're close to people. You know, there are different outdoors. There's an outdoors where people are packed together, cheek to jowl, and there's an outdoors where you're walking in the woods on your own. So I think you have to take it with the context in mind. I know that's not the kind of simple answer that people like. I wear them outside here in New York City. It makes other people comfortable. And I may, quickly go into a store for something, and I may not have a mask to quickly put on. So I think this is one of the things that should change in the coming months. As more people get vaccinated, we'll reduce case numbers, and I think we can stop wearing masks outside in communities where we don't have intense levels of spread.
All right, Dr. Tom Frieden, always good to see you. You always make us smarter and safer. Coming up next, the market opening seconds are actually open right about now, and we're getting a brand new sign of economic recovery this morning. It's Thursday. That means we get the weekly jobless number. This as Republicans are set to lay out their counter proposal to President Biden's infrastructure plan. Congressman Kevin Brady joins me live, and we've got a brand new digital episode of Money Makeovers out today. I spoke with a woman who has spent much of her pandemic saving, planning, and now it is time for her to take some financial risks, invest, maybe even travel. Find out what we recommended on NBCNews.com. Stock market opened moments ago after we learned this morning that 547,000 Americans filed for unemployment benefits in the last week. That number is again dropping to the lowest level since the pandemic began as businesses across the country start to open up. CNBC's Dom Chu is here to break it down. Dom, put this number into context for us. Where is this number compared to where we were pre-pandemic?
Oh, no, absolutely. So, Stephanie, you mentioned it just now. Things are continuing to get better, so that's the good news. That headline number that you just read off, 547,000 weekly jobless claims, it was also below the consensus estimate from economists that were polled as well, and it's also lower than they were last week, which was also a pandemic low until the new pandemic low was hit this week. So that continued drop in the number of Americans filing for first-time unemployment benefits is that just another sign that things are slowly getting back to normal. It could also show that the country could be getting set for a relatively robust summer if things continue on this track. More states are in the process of planning to ease COVID restrictions, especially here in the tri-state area. Companies are looking to hire again. That's the good news. Now, the bad news is there are still millions of Americans who remain in a situation where they've been collecting unemployment benefits for multiple weeks now. That's the so-called continuing claims number. It still stands at a very unacceptable 3.7 million people. Yes, much lower. And just to go back in time, the pandemic peak, Stephanie, of that continuing claims number was nearly 25 million Americans last year in May that were collecting multiple weeks of unemployment benefits. But still, though, it shows there's a long way to go. And by the way, Stephanie, still around 17.5 million people are receiving some sort of pandemic-related program assistance. I mentioned companies starting to hire again. We are hearing, by the way, anecdotes from various parts of the country about the difficulty in finding people to hire as things in the economy get going again. That's going to be something, Stephanie, to watch in the coming weeks.
Especially in those lower wage jobs, service jobs. Many people in the service industry left the industry last year. They're now working permanently in warehouse centers. And to Dom's points, while people are getting full-time unemployment assistance, it's hard to get them back and do part-time work. We don't offer part-time benefits. Dom, thank you. Sure. Now let's turn to Capitol Hill, where in just a few hours from now, Republicans are set to unveil their counter-proposal to President Biden's $2 trillion infrastructure plan. While Democrats are not likely to get on board to this plan, It could be a step in the right direction in terms of negotiations. Also today, a group of bipartisan, ding, 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 I like to ring a bell when we say that word, bipartisan senators meet again to work on their own infrastructure proposal that they hope both sides could agree on. NBC's Leanne Caldwell is on Capitol Hill. Leanne, when I get to say the word bipartisan and negotiations, you know that means I'm inviting you on. What do we know about this GOP counterproposal?
Well, hopefully the words bipartisan and negotiations actually come to fruition. But President Biden told Republicans that they can't just oppose his infrastructure proposal. They have to come up with an alternative. And that's what they are doing. They are unveiling a framework today led by Republican Senator Shelley Moore Capito of West Virginia and Roger Wicker of Mississippi. It's just going to be a fraction of President Biden's plan, around the $600 to perhaps $800 billion proposal. And it's going to focus on traditional infrastructure, roads, bridges, ports. But, Steph, when you take apart the Biden infrastructure plan and you just take out the traditional infrastructure, it also is just over $600 billion. So they might not be that far apart if they can agree on what the definition of infrastructure is. Now, the most complicated part, of course, is how to pay for it. These Republicans in their plan are expected to propose user fees, like electric vehicle drivers who don't pay a gasoline tax will have some sort of other tax to help pay for this plan, and other things like that. That is something that Democrats are likely going to oppose. Meanwhile, while you have the Democratic plan, the Republican plan coming out later today, then there's this moderate group in the middle who are hoping to be the Goldilocks of this entire situation and bring both sides together. They are working on a compromise proposal, but once again, how to pay for it is still difficult for them too. Steph.
Well, let's discuss how this thing gets paid for. Leanne, thank you. And bring in top Republican on the House Ways and Means Committee, Texas Congressman Kevin Brady. Congressman, always good to see you. I know it's being led on the Senate side, but can you share any details about this Republican counteroffer? And are you on board based on what you know?
So we're watching this carefully, and clearly I think there's consensus that really I think the president needs to start over on this, because let's start with bipartisan support. Roads, bridges, infrastructure, and broadband, for example, have always been priorities for both parties. We've always worked together on those issues. Why not do that again? I think refocusing it down on not just traditional infrastructure, but looking at broadband issues like that make perfect sense. And of course, when he coupled that with the largest tax increase in 70 years on job creators, as we're trying to recover from a economic crisis, that makes no sense. In fact, the economists seem to show that America is the net loser in this economically when you add those tax increases. So I think this is certainly the right direction.
Well, let's talk through that, because even though we would get a tax increase for corporates, it's still below where we were for corporates 4 years ago. If you don't like the idea of corporations paying more taxes to pay for this infrastructure bill, where would we get the money from? Who pays?
So this is a proposed 1/3 increase on taxes on job creators. It would be a rate worse than China and the same as Syria. It will mean slower growth and hiring here. It will mean more jobs moving overseas.
But then how do you want to pay for it?
A second wave. But the point is, I think we'll see a second wave, U.S. companies moving overseas. Here is where I would focus. Infrastructure, especially roads and bridges, has always been tied to user fees. I would look at that. Secondly, we don't make very good use of a lot of our incentives right now. I think our private activity bonds need to be refocused on infrastructure. I think we look at our bonding abilities. And the other thing, Stephanie, as you know, there is a ton of private capital around that would love to invest in America's infrastructure. We don't do it as strongly as many other countries do. I say let's draw this private capital into these solutions. It doesn't always have to be government taxes.
All right. Here's a question for you. Corporations don't want their taxes raised, but this infrastructure program would help corporate America. Roads, bridges, expanded broadband, job creation, the economy having more money. That would be great for corporations. So why shouldn't they have to pay for any of this? They'll benefit.
It is all offset economically by these tax increases. Over the long term, infrastructure does help us grow the economy, not so much over the short term. Long term, it does. But the tax increases, as you know, land not on the corporations. They don't pay it. They collect it. Lands on their workers, on their customers with price increases, on families counting on it for retirement. And again, there's no question when our tax rate is so much worse than our global competitors, you know, you're going to see companies moving overseas. And I will tell you the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, whether you agree with it or not, it ended that the inversions, as we call it, companies moving headquarters, manufacturing overseas. It created a giant sucking sound back into the United States. We risk those jobs and investment with these tax increases. Why? So bottom line is, why are we funding infrastructure on the back of American workers?
Then do you agree with Janet Yellen, who wants to have a global minimum tax rate that would force companies to not repatriate themselves, set up headquarters in countries overseas? Do you like that idea?
Yeah, so no, America already has the global minimum tax to make sure that companies aren't moving profits into low tax countries. We already have that in place. The rest of the world, when Secretary Yellen, who I respect, comes to them and says, we voluntarily slowed economic growth and made ourselves uncompetitive, won't you please join us? I think we'll slough that off pretty quickly. We are doing voluntarily, sort of sabotaging their own competitiveness. Why in the world would they join us?
I have to ask you, we have seen shooting after shooting in the past month. I know it is not easy to get things done in terms of gun control, or gun reform, I should say, gun safety. But an overwhelming number of Americans want something done in terms of safety. You are retiring. You don't need to get elected again in the state of Texas. Is it time to take some sort of stand on guns?
It is time to find real solutions, especially these mass shootings. I've not seen them in Washington. I really do think we need to focus more on keeping those guns out of the hands of the bad actors. None of these laws do that. The other thing, and I'm kind of hopeful here, we do not have a mental health care system. A lot of these mass shootings are tied to it. I think COVID, which created for the first time telemedicine and telehealth and ability to reach people when they're in crisis, I think this gives us an opportunity for both parties to sort of tackle what we haven't tackled, which is the mental health side of this is really driving this violence. And I think this could be a bipartisan approach.
Then just before we go, you said you haven't seen a good plan in Washington. You don't have to wait to see it. You can write it. You're in office. What would be your plan to make us more safe in terms of guns?
I would focus on making sure our background checks work better, that the information about bad actors, potential ones, are in there. They're not. Secondly, I would really focus on how do criminals and how do bad actors get those. That's been lost. And finally, as I said, I would really get aggressive on the mental health care side of things.
All right, Congressman, thank you so much for joining me this morning. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Stephanie.
And any minute now, the Senate is set to vote on a bill to fight anti-Asian hate crimes. It could make the Justice Department speed up reviews of hate crimes related to COVID-19 and give local officials support to respond to anti-Asian violence. It comes a month after the Atlanta spa shootings that killed a total of 8 people, including 6 women of Asian descent. Vicki Nguyen has been all over this story since the beginning. It's personal. Vicki, how would this bill directly help members of the AAPI community?
Hey, good morning, Stephanie. If it passes, the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act would signal to people in the AAPI community that you matter, that we at the federal level recognize what Asian Americans have gone through over this past year, which is being the targets of racism linked to coronavirus. Now, if you break down the bill and actually look at basically the 4 parts and the things that it's really calling for, yes, 1, an expediting the review of hate crimes by the Justice Department. 2, going and giving resources to agencies across the country at the local level to help them educate people about what is a hate crime, how do you report a hate crime, and doing that in multiple languages. It also calls for the denouncing and condemnation of racism and rhetoric against Asians. And I think really the most important part of this act would be the expansion of the collection of data for reporting hate crimes. Right now, there is no federal database. There is no one uniform way to take a look at hate crimes across all different groups and understand what's happening so that you can actually enforce the laws and address spikes in the crimes. Right now, the only reliable data that we have comes from a nonprofit agency called Stop AAPI Hate. And in a 12-month period that started last March, as the coronavirus started to spread across the U.S., they recorded about 3,800 incidents of anti-Asian racism, ranging from verbal assaults all the way to physical attacks against the elderly. 68% of those crimes were reported by women. So we are getting a sense of what's happening, but it's not enough. So if this passes, it would really be a step toward letting the Asian American community, the 23 million Asian Americans in this country, letting them know you matter.
You absolutely do. Vicki, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for covering this. We're going to leave it there. Coming up, a story you haven't heard about, but you do not want to miss. Dozens of major retailers we know have gone bankrupt during this pandemic. But I want to tell you who pays when the big guys go down. You know the answer is going to be the little guy. I'll explain.